everybody, and welcome to our session. We're going to be looking at future-proofing farms against climate change, the role of trees in healthy soil management. And so we're going to consider the potential role of trees on farm and their value in enabling a sustainable long-term good soil quality. And as perennial species, the way in which we will use them and integrate them in and manage them within that farm system. So thanks, first of all, to the Woodland Trust for pulling us all together. I've got three fabulous but contrasting speakers. The first of them is Professor Jenny Dungait. She runs an independent soil science consultancy, the Soil Health Expert. She's editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Soil Science and has all sorts of interactions with universities, the Scottish Regional University College in Edinburgh, University of Exeter, and has many years' experience focusing on application of science to problems of soil management and agriculture. She has particularly been concentrating on organic matter management, and I know that she's passionate about knowledge exchange. So it's great to have her as our starting speaker. Over to you, Jenny.
Hello, is my screen up? Is it up? So I can get going. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lydia, for the introduction, and also thank you to the Woodland Trust for inviting me to talk to you about how having trees on your farm might help to manage your soil, especially under climate change challenges. So, it's not moving. This isn't good.
Jenny, if you go ahead and click on where it says click into the presentation, you should be able to use your arrow keys to move left and right.
Click into my presentation.
Yeah, so just click on it first, and then you should be able to move left and right on it.
Not working.
All right. This is the 2020 problem here. So are you in a PowerPoint?
Oh, let me try this. Is this working now?
No, we still see the soil health expert.
Something briefly happened.
Something briefly went into a picture.
There we go. We got it.
We're away. I just can't see myself anymore. Okay, so sorry everybody. Let's get going then. So yes, so this is the graph I wanted to show you first of all to put this talk into context, which shows the challenges faced by farmers around the world due to climate change. Over the last 50 years, there's been an increase in the number of flooding and extreme weather events, which are described as disasters across the world. You can see the pink here are floods and the brown here are extreme weather events, and these are caused by climate change. So I'm going to focus on the UK because that's where I am, but the principles of what I'm going to say apply around the world, I hope. So it's clear that the United Kingdom is affected by more extreme weather now. We frequently hear of new records being broken for rainfall, heat and wind, last year being no exception, with a period of record rainfall during the winter, rapidly switching to a period of drought in the spring. And then last autumn, we were back in the wet again, with October the 3rd being the wettest day ever recorded in the UK. So question we have to ask, isn't it, is what tools do farmers have to help to cope with these rapidly changing conditions? And today we would like to propose that the strategic reintroduction of trees to farmed landscapes holds great potential to improve soil health, to manage the effects of climate change, and ultimately to build economic and environmental resilience of farming systems. I thought it might be helpful to start to think about how trees and soils work together in natural ecosystems using a simple diagram. So this diagram shows you that above ground, there's a diverse plant community that has different layers, from large trees through smaller trees in the secondary canopy and shrubs, and then grasses and herbs on the forest floor. Below ground, the soil is also in layers, starting with a little layer on the soil surface where leaves are breaking down, the topsoil where broken down leaves mix in with the mineral soil, then subsoil further down, and then what we call the regolith, which is where the bedrock is breaking down and new soil is forming, and where our minerals are really coming from. The roots of the plants, shown here in black, are also different depending on what type of plant they are from. And in red, I've tried to show the Mycorrhizae, these beneficial fungi which form associations with roots, which reach beyond the rooting zone to acquire water and nutrients, take them back to the plants where they're exchanged for carbon from photosynthesis. Also within natural systems, we also have diverse animal communities, large herbivores, invertebrates, and then in the soil, again, microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, and all of these work together to break down and recycle carbon and also nutrients back into a condition that the plants can use again. So if we compare the diverse natural system on the left to that on the right, which is a conventional arable monoculture, it's clear that there are very large differences. So poor plant diversity, much reduced litter layer, shallow roots with few mycorrhizal associations, no large animals, poorer soil biology and poor soil structure. And a really important difference in many farming systems is compaction caused by heavy machinery used for tillage. And subsurface compaction is often a hidden feature of degraded farm soils. And I've indicated it here as the hatched line in the topsoil. Even if the soil on the top, the topsoil looks good, compaction further down forms a barrier to root growth and the movement of water and nutrients. So there are plenty of tools, I won't concentrate on these, that you can use to assess whether you have compaction below the soil surface. They're all freely available, and but digging a hole is always a good first start to see what's going on below the soil surface. So this is what a badly compacted soil looks like on the left. So you have capping at the soil surface and then compaction in the topsoil and in the subsoil. And of course, when it rains, the water hasn't got anywhere to go but sideways across the top of the compaction layer. And in some circumstances, the soil below the compaction layer can be dry, even though the surface is saturated. So the benefits of trees in this sort of situation are quite clear, because their big woody roots help to open up the soil and to keep it open, helping to water to infiltrate deeper into the soil. And the infiltration rates can be hugely larger under trees, up to 70 times larger than in soils with no trees. Furthermore, the canopy of trees intercepts rain and channels it down the trunk and into the soil. And of course, the litter layer, which is building up with the leaves which are falling from the canopy, absorbs water and also slows surface flow. If you're on sloping land, large plants like trees anywhere on that slope will slow down the movement of water and the movement of eroded soil into watercourses and off the farm, often as we see onto roads and urban environments. If the trees are used as buffer strips next to watercourses, excess nutrients in the water can also be mopped up by the tree, preventing them from causing water pollution. One of the well-known benefits of trees is the ability to reduce the effects of wind. Shelter belts of different trees are often seen in the landscape, and these are particularly important in flat land with light soils in dry weather. The photo at the top on the right shows what's known as fen blow in the fenlands of eastern England, where organic topsoil is easily dried out and blown, and below a dust storm in Texas last summer, which looks very much like the Dust Bowl scenes from the 1930s. So this is something, as it says on the farmland website, is something that we can't ignore. How big are tree roots? Well, they can be absolutely huge. And on the left here, you can see the root of a kiwi plant from New Zealand, from an orchard there. And if you want a sense of scale, at the bottom is a small man. He's actually about 6 foot. So this is an absolutely huge root. But huge roots need to grow in very deep soils. And in countries like the UK, our soils are much shallower. So tree roots here rarely get beyond a couple of meters deep. And this wonderful picture from East Malling Research, which was used at the Royal Horticultural Show a few years ago, shows the extent of an apple root. But these huge tree roots, huge tree roots surely suck up all the water and nutrients and outcompete the plants growing next to them, don't they? Well, not in all situations. That can actually be a beneficial process called hydraulic lift. So this simple diagram shows you what happens during the day. So during the day, trees suck up water from the soil into their roots and into their trunk, essentially becoming a vertical reservoir. But at night, when transpiration stops, water and minerals are distributed from the deeper soil to the rooting zone around the tree, so that growing trees with crops can actually be of benefit in dry weather. Of course, this only works if you have a mixture of trees and other plants, and tree monocultures are generally bad for soil health, especially if the soil is bare or trees are planted too close together. And there are some examples from around the world there. So having trees in the farm system seems to be a good idea for water management, but there are other benefits for agricultural production and the health of the agricultural environment. Multi-canopy cropping or polyculture is a widespread practice around the world. There are many benefits, including the fact that you get more crops per unit of land, which can give you economic resilience because you have more products, and also if there are pests or problems with weather, which cause problems with one or the other of the crops, there's still an output from the land. And of course, biodiversity benefits, carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling are additional benefits. I won't talk any further about those though today. So there's photos show some trees and crops growing together in challenging environments. In a very wet environment in India, where mango trees are being grown with rice paddy, and on the right, a very, very thin eroded soil in China, where maize, peanuts, a leguminous plant, and apples in the background are being grown together to get the most out of a very, very degraded situation. Like we saw in the beginning, large herbivores are a normal part of natural ecosystems. They are effectively working as recycling engines, accelerating the return of carbon and nutrients from the plants back to the soil. The animals themselves benefit from trees for shade and fodder. The practice of feeding tree leaves to ruminants was widespread in the UK up until the beginning of last century. But of course, lots of farmers around the world regularly grow trees as browse to feed their animals. And these are often leguminous trees, which are very nutritious and also bring nitrogen into the soil. Tree leaves may also contain other beneficial compounds, which are good for animal health and for the environment. For example, the emu bush in Australia reduces methane production from the rumen and is very, very tolerant of dry conditions. So there are all sorts of benefits, and many more perhaps that we'll realise, as we start to include these ideas in our farming systems moving ahead. So in summary, for my talk, extreme weather is getting worse and more unpredictable because of climate change everywhere in the world. Strategic use of trees can help to manage the impacts of flooding and drought on farms by improving soil health. In wet areas, trees can help rainwater to infiltrate soil, slow down the rate of water and soil erosion, and mop up excess nutrients. And in dry weather, trees can help to reduce the strength of the wind across dry surfaces, preventing wind erosion, and also draw up deep water to the soil surface. So agroforestry and silvopastoral systems provide farmers with options to improve economic and environmental resilience under conditions of climate change. And so I'd just like to finish by saying thank you for listening, and also Happy New Year, and happy to hand on to these chaps now.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for really setting the scene beautifully. There's a whole host of fabulous questions that are coming from our listeners, but I think we'll stick with the format of waiting till the end, and we'll put the whole set to all. So we will therefore, without further ado, move over to our second speaker, who is Stephen Briggs. So Stephen Briggs is at Abacus Agriculture Limited. He is where Jenny is very much from the academic community. Stephen is very much from the farming community, and he really walks the walk and talks the talk. So he's been looking at conversion of his 125-acre farm to much greater utilization of trees alongside his wife, and with a real long-term view into ecological intensification and long-term impact on his farm. So I don't want to detract from Stephen's talk. The floor is yours, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Lydia. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay, and hopefully the presentation will come up in a second. Let's have a look. Can you see anything? Because I can't.
Stephen, if you could just make sure that the PowerPoint is not minimized.
Not minimized? Yeah,
yeah,
it's not minimized.
So we see it now, and then just go to full screen and see what. Let's see what happens. So did you go? Are you on the slideshow view?
Yeah,
there we go. We're good now.
Okay, I can't see you guys, but that doesn't matter. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Stephen Briggs. As Lydia said, I'm a farmer in Eastern Cambridgeshire in the United Kingdom. What I'm going to talk about is experiences from my own farm, where we established Agroforestry in 2009, how we've used it to address soil health issues, some of the challenges with establishing agroforestry and how we manage the system, and some of the experiences in terms of impacts on soil, and also some of the research that we've been doing. So we farm in the east of England, where we're a 110 hectare, 280 acre organically certified farm for the last 13 years, a mixture of owned land, but mainly rented, tenanted land. So I'm quite unusual in that sense, in that we've established agroforestry on land that we rent rather than we own. And the farm historically had a big problem with soil health, with some pretty degraded soils from long-term monoculture, high-intensity cropping. You can see a sort of overview of the fields. We're in a pretty flat area, largely devoid of trees, although if you went back a couple of hundred years, it would have been largely wet woodland before the land was drained by the Dutch in the sort of 1600s. So some of the main drivers for us really were land degradation from wind erosion, and wanting to find a way to reduce the degradation of our high quality peat soils, trying to introduce more multifunctional land use, greater diversity with our enterprises on the farm and with cropping to improve the soils that we've got, alongside both in enhancing biodiversity and habitats and opening up new markets. So we looked at agroforestry nearly 20 years ago. Before we got started, I was very fortunate to do a Nuffield farming scholarship study around the globe looking at agroforestry, and I recognised the benefits in terms of improving soil and water quality protection, as Jenny has already said, reducing wind speed at ground level, which in turn reduces evaporation and water loss from crops, and conversely, in real wet times, improving drainage by really looking at trying to modify those microclimates on a local basis. So it was about building resilience into the system against drought and also against deluge, and having lots of water or not enough. So in 2009, we planted 52 hectares or 125 acres at 85 trees per hectare across that landscape. And our limitations were a 15-year rental agreement or a farm business tenancy, that we needed to retain the eligibility for the Common Agricultural Policy at the time. We had limited capital, being for fairly new farmers, but we needed a system that needed to be profitable, and we didn't have any livestock facilities on the farm, so it was very much a cropping system. So we chose to use fruit trees, and we concentrated on 13 varieties of apples, which I'll come to later. And we established the system across the farm, let's say 85 trees per hectare of a density across all the fields, 3 meters between each tree in the row, 27 meters between each row, with a 3-meter pollen and nectar stream underneath each row, leaving us a 24-meter working alley. All those strips were planted with a sort of pollen and nectar mix, which then enhanced that area in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of pollinators, which are important for the fruit trees. Some of the challenges that we experienced are well, security. We had a few thefts early on, people relocating trees. We had the driest spring on record for 30 years when the trees went in. We had issues with things like birds and pigeons, rooks, corvids, and you can see one on a post there. When the trees went in initially, as you can see from the previous slide, we went in with a wire mesh guard and just a very small cane, bamboo cane for support alongside the post. But we went back and put in a 3 to 4 meter bamboo cane so that the big birds actually land on top of those, because if they were landing on the top of just the tree, they'd be breaking the tops of the trees out. So now the system's established on 52 hectares. This is sort of more what it looks like 8 or 9, 10 years later. The trees are productive, the pollen nectar strips are working well, and that allows us to get 2 crops. So we're multi-cropping. We're taking a cereal crop between the trees, and we're taking a fruit crop from the agroforestry tree strips. What this has also allowed us to do is develop a controlled traffic farming system. Because we've got a 24-meter alley, all our machinery now is developed using 6-meter, 12-meter, 24-meter machinery, so that all our machinery only treads in the same place up and down between the rows and the alleys, allowing us to minimize the compaction that Jenny talked about. So farming organically, we grow everything on a wide row, and we use a computer-guided Garford robo-crop to inter-row hoe the cereals, and then the combine comes back and actually harvests treading on the same place. So we've developed a controlled traffic farming system to rationalize our machinery around the agroforestry system. What this has also allowed us to do is think further in terms of integrating more diversity into the system by having not only trees above the crops, but the arable crops themselves, and then companion plants growing underneath the cereal crops. So we've got a multi-layered system, which is building carbon, always keeping the ground covered, and actually trying to harvest as much sunlight as possible. One of the things that we do though is actually we root prune religiously every year. So we go along the tree lines with a deep subsoiler, trying to minimize ground disturbance at the surface, but actually root pruning to actually try and train the roots of the trees so that they're not competing in the same place and time as the actual cereal crop itself. So what we're looking for is that diversity both above ground in terms of canopy and different crop types, but also in terms of diversity below ground to minimize the competition and maximize the sort of sharing of resources. We've been working with some universities over the last decade, gathering information in terms of biodiversity and also in terms of soil. And some of the work that's been done by Tom Stanton and Alexa Vara at Reading University shows many benefits with agroforestry in terms of more fungi, more insects, more beneficial plants, birds, etc. And it's generally the beneficial organisms that we see more of in agroforestry, and less of the harmful insects of the parasitic type and the potential pests. So there's some real good news in terms of increasing that level of diversity. From a practical perspective, actually, what we also see is resilience against storm events. So this picture shows some organic oats grown in 2019. We had a big storm event in the middle of August when in 2019 when the crops were dry and effectively threshed in the field, and probably 20% of the grain in the ear ready for harvest was threshed out of the crop and ended up on the floor. So it was unharvestable. However, in the agroforestry, we actually only saw about 10% loss because we were cutting down the wind speed at ground level. So we actually halved our losses. So it really came into its own in 2019. In 2020, last year, being one of the driest summers on record that we've seen, we saw some real differences adjacent to the tree rows, where the crops were much, as the picture shows, much better and much taller and much higher yielding nearer the trees. And we put that down to probably better drainage in the winter when it was really wet, and better moisture retention with some hydraulic lift by the trees for bringing moisture up to the surface in the summer. And as you can see there, the crops were much better actually adjacent to the trees. So we've developed the system. It's working well. It's more than 10 years old. It's profitable. We've been monitoring soils over that period of time. And what we have seen is actually, and some work we're doing at the moment, we're seeing an increase in mycorrhizae adjacent to the tree lines, which we think not only improves soil drainage, but also resilience in terms of climate change. We're able to retain more nutrients and turn those into carbon without them being lost. There's ongoing research by the University of Reading at the moment, looking at agroforestry and what that can bring to carbon sequestration by Michelle Fenton and her team. And the preliminary results are showing, much more carbon stored under cropland with agroforestry. Most of that is in the root biomass. That's contributing to improving agriculture's footprint in terms of climate change, applicable very much at a sort of national level and a regional level in terms of climate change and net zero. And there's some real opportunities for us as farmers to think about how trees can integrate into systems in terms of the carbon that they can bring, given that trees are occupying different spaces above ground and below ground. Ultimately, I think if we could move towards around 5.8% of land cover converted into tree canopy as agroforestry, we could move towards our zero net emissions target under the Paris Accord. Agroforestry, as Lydia said, is very much ecological intensification. It's using what we've got in terms of nutrients and sunlight better. Profitability can be equal to or greater than monoculture. It's enhancing our soil and our biodiversity and improving the long-term resilience of our systems. Ultimately, we're harvesting more sun with different both perennials and annuals. We're using that water and those nutrients at different times and in different places. It really could be a smart breakthrough for agriculture moving forward, and trees will grow in most places, and it's three-dimensional farming, making the farm bigger and using those resources better. Okay, well, I hope that's been interesting, and I look forward to the questions later on. Thank you.
Brilliant, Stephen. I've been wanting to come up and see your farm for some time because I'm quite local to you, but lockdown restrictions have made that somewhat difficult. But I'm really looking forward to extracting a invitation off you soon. We're running just a couple of minutes fast, so we've got a little bit of time. I'm just going to take Chairman's privilege and ask a question that relates to both your and Jenny's talk. You both mentioned mycorrhizae. This is, a really important component, particularly of some of these perennial species. And Jenny obviously has access to university resources, but how, as a farmer, can you find out whether you do have those associations in your farm?
As a farmer, but actually I trained as a soil scientist as well, so I can spot it. But we have been monitoring using commercial labs, looking at the mycorrhizal populations, and we're actually doing some work with Reading University to actually try and map those mycorrhizal populations across the alleys and the agroforestry system. And unsurprisingly, we find much higher levels of mycorrhizae in and adjacent to the tree rows where there are perennials and it's undisturbed compared to other areas of the field. But even a partial increase across the field is going to give a reservoir of resilience, which the rest of the farming system can build from.
Brilliant. Okay, well, there's a lot of questions ganging up, but I'll stick to my line that we'll take most of them at the end. So we will pass you, and thank you so much for a brilliant talk. We'll pass now to our last speaker, which is Phil Jarvis from the Allerton Project. So he is head of farming, also at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, which and his farm, where he does a lot of the work that he's going to tell us about, is in Leicestershire. It's 320 hectares and it's mixed. So we've got arable and sheep grazing enterprises there. So it's a climate-friendly farming approach to land management, and he's been looking at environmental enhancement, and he's also, by the way, an NFU Environment Forum chair. So I think of Phil very much as almost a hybrid between an academic and a farmer. So a perfect end speaker for our session. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, let's see what happens now. That's going to work. Oh, let's just get that on to. Can you see the full screen?
Yep, we've got you, Phil. You're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to really look at. Thanks very much indeed, Lydia, for that introduction. I'm going to look at, holistic, the big picture, the synergy, how all these things connect, and how they're multifunctional in a landscape. Because often there's a term that's being used quite a lot now, which is about regenerative farming. And what does it mean? Well, there's loads of definitions about regenerative farming, but usually there's an outcome and there's a process by which to get there, and a lot of them are all joined up. And so I think it's worth looking at, habitats within, whether it be agri-environment habitats, whether it be human habitation, ancient woodlands, hedges, production off those grass fields, and some of the stuff Jenny's talking about as well is, the having protection from sun and wind and rain for your animals is, it's pretty good on their efficiency as well. So animals, if they're not using energy to keep themselves warm, then that's really important as well. And of course, there's more recreational and there's more arable cropping as well. But I'm just going to give you a little bit about a mixed approach at the Allerton Project, and this sort of cultivation, soil kind of cover, animals, grass, diversity, and roots. And roots, Stephen's already alluded to them, as Jenny has as well. And we really have got to think about the way we go forward in the future. Some of our farming is going to change, and bringing back some of those principles of good husbandry and letting nature do some of the work for us is going to be really important in the future. So the one thing we shouldn't avoid talking about as well is that, we need to produce some food here as well. And if I don't mention it later, I'll mention it now. A lot of the things that we're suggesting, a lot of the marketplaces that we're for some of the produce off these trees is going to need to have some half decent trade arrangements for us, or it's going to need us to try and secure much better local markets and really market the produce from the fields that we're changing to look after the environment. So I leave that as a thought at the end of that slide. So of course, in our farm, we're doing reduced cultivations, looking at trying not to disturb the soil where possible, appropriate cultivation, smallish field sizes, and we're also looking at cover cropping as well. So not only when I get on to talk about trees, we're looking for multi-crop habitats in here, because sometimes it doesn't always work. So in this case, there was 4 or 5 other things, but late drilled, and the Phacelia and a few oats and a little bit of veg came, but some of the other things didn't come. So getting good soil cover, getting your farming system working to growing crops is really important. And then obviously this is one that's on our farm at the moment, and so when some of the high rainfall comes down, and this is going to go into spring wheat next year, this will probably get grazed off by sheep in the next month or so. I feel my soil is pretty well protected there. It's also got biomass in there. It's got all the things Jenny was talking about, rooting from trees, but I got it in my fields as well. So it's just worth putting a few points about the whole farm picture, and then looking about some of the woods that we've planted here. So we've got some traditional Leicester longwools. Our neighbour it has South Devon cattle, and we, and some of the land is grazed with next door sheep as well. But in this picture here is 2 woods, one that's 70 or 80 years old, another one that's more like 20 years old, and the one that's nearest to us is one that has a much more diverse population of trees, from larches to cherry, yes, there is a bit of ash in there, and we have got ash dieback, and we will have to replant there. And some of our agroforestry, anything we plant now doesn't actually have ash in it. But the landscape there and the ecosystem services that are provided by, you know, cleaning up air, providing for insects, fungi, food chains for birds, etc., is really important on that landscape, as are the hedges as well. And I think the one thing we probably can do as well is improve the nature of our hedges as well, because we can put more diversity in them, we can let them grow wider and let them really function as some wildlife corridors through the farm. And you know, bringing in herbal lays as well. And this picture is one of the experiments we've got at Nottington as well. So this regenerative approach is not just about trees, but if I highlight some of the trees in here, new trees that have been in 25 years, the trees on the left-hand side, right at the front there, are trees that were planted 60 or 70 years ago, conifers, single stand of things. And the trees we've planted next to them 25 years ago, probably 10 different species, so much more diversity. And probably 25 years ago, we probably could have put some more fruit trees in, and we probably could have put nut trees in, and that's something certainly we'll be looking at in the future. So herbal lays, really good for fertility, really good as a holistic system in a wooded landscape or in a tree and hedgerow landscape, really important. So just to talk about some of the stuff we're doing as well, and about feeding willow to lambs at the moment. One of my colleagues, Professor Chris Stowe, is doing some work on feeding willow to supplement minerals such as cobalt and zinc and control intestinal worms, and trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from urine patches. I mean, results, hopefully some of the results will be out in the next few months, but that's interesting to see whether or not some of what we might grow on the farm might be able to supplement or help us with some of those issues that modern sheep production or food production with lambs, and make, you know, a healthier lifestyle, a more varied diet for our sheep on the farm. And diversity as well is very, and the reason I put this one up is that some of our future plans may well include trees in between all these strips. So we'll be looking at maybe growing fruit and nut trees, but instead of that, then we may well have some biodiversity mixes with flowering plants in them. And of course, these go on now. At the moment, this is just a plethora of seed and is full of finches and wintering birds just feeding on the finches. But if we plant trees between this, and we perhaps grow things like sweet corn, or we grow other crops between them, then that's got a real potential for us, south facing as well. So a lot of potential there in the future. And now looking particularly at agroforestry, and our agroforestry, we've got about 10 acres of this, and it's very much looking at different densities. We're doing different, looking at water infiltration. We're looking at how long, and this is probably going to be over a 25-year period as well. How long does it keep being productive, i.e. for the animals in there, and how long is it before the shade takes place and we don't get you know, agricultural production out of there, and how good is it for soil structure, absorbing water, etc., and earthworms, etc., and all those other biodiversity things. So, you know, from our point of view, unlike Stephen's, this is probably from a landscape, and there are other things that agroforestry can do. So obviously places for people to walk, places for people to enjoy as well. And I saw there was a question in the chat room as well about where people could probably go, and I've answered that, and hopefully that will be transferred back to the comment room. So if I look at just a few more as well as, and looking at, you know, how sometimes management for us is a bit of a problem with these trees. We have had some, if we manage it too tightly, then it's not just the birds that sit on top of them, Stephen, it's the sheep get on top of them and start eating the tops of them out. So we have had to have a bit of undergrazing this year just to let some of the sheep let some of the trees get away. And if this is an aerial view of one of the plots as well, and it's very much about helping us with our carbon footprint and delivering net zero as well. So, you know, and how can we monetize this in future? So with cover crops, hedgerows, trees, you know, it might not just be sustainable food we're after. We might be looking to farm other things as well, and be a solution to some of the climate problems that Jenny was alluding to early on. So once again, this is shows different trees planted at different times, and the more younger trees are the ones that have much more varied canopy cover. in our landscape, the more mature trees tend to be, there's a bit of sycamore in there, there's a bit of ash in there, there's a little bit of beech, but there's 4 or 5 species rather than the 10 species that we've planted. That makes a much more better diverse environment. And really, the agroforestry bit here, the government has recognised, and there is advice now on agroforestry in the basic payment scheme. So I encourage people to look up there. I would just end with a few comments that would just say planting the right tree in the right place. So, if it's low yielding land and it's not of particularly good environmental value, then it's really important that that's a good place. But, if you have, some maybe historical features, or you maybe have some traditional meadows, that might not be the right place to it. If you have traditional brecklands or stuff like that, that might not be the right place. I think we've also got to address things on tree guards going forward, and I'd be interested to know if there's any comments on how we can make our tree guards more sustainable rather than planting so many trees and plastics in there. And we'll be looking at fruit and nuts and developing a market locally, possibly with other farmers in clusters and groups like that. So really that's just a whistle-stop tour around our agroforestry and our farming ethos at the Allerton Project. And I think I'll hand back to Lydia.
Brilliant, and thank you so much, Phil. And can I congratulate all of your speakers for being so perfectly on time. We have a whole host of questions, and I just want to remind everybody that we'll deal with these over the next quarter of an hour or so, but we can head off for a Zoom meeting afterwards as well. So, I just want to get out of my house now and immediately go and visit some of these sites. I feel quite fired up about some of the work that's going on here. But obviously there are issues when you set up these kind of agroforestry plantings. There are issues, and I think a lot of the questions are reflecting that. So the first one is, how accessible are tree care packages for farmers? So I guess that's somebody that's coming into it brand new. And are they subsidised by any kind of government schemes to encourage farmers to plant more and more types of trees? So you touched on that a little bit, Phil. So I'm going to go over to you first to answer that, and probably get some comments from the others too.
Yeah, no, I did put something in the chat room as well, in our chat, but the Woodland Trust do have some grant schemes, and you'll often find some local authorities will join up with them for schemes as well. So and it's something that we're pressing with our local Leicestershire authority as well, to perhaps to help manage some of their carbon as well, offset some of their carbon. But there's some great stuff with scrub and hedgerow management available in agri-environment schemes. And the government recently, well, probably a year or two ago, launched this Woodland Carbon Guarantee, which is probably much for bigger schemes. There's £50 million in it. It's a guarantee if you get in, but it's still a competitive tender. So it can be a bit deceiving, the title. And obviously there's some great agroforestry stuff online. And we're doing a project with agroecology as well now, bringing some case studies to show how we can develop them further.
In terms of funding, Lydia, the position we're at the moment is that any government funding for trees, which is directed through the Forestry Commission, most agroforestry systems are at too low a density to qualify for those forestry schemes. DEFRA are currelly in England anyhow funding a test and trials program on agroforestry, and we're looking at how agroforestry can get into the new ELMS environmental land management program, because I think there's at long last a recognition that a division between agriculture and forestry, agroforestry fits in the middle, and it doesn't fit forestry grant schemes, it doesn't fit agroforestry grant schemes, and there needs to be a case of putting agroforestry square and centre in our new domestic agriculture policy, as it is in other places within Europe and around the world where it is funded and supported.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And I think you mentioned agroecology, and our Katie Bliss was great in helping pull the group together. And there are information sheets on the agroecology website, in addition to some of the government help that you can get. Okay, so the second question we have is, and it's a tragic question actually. Some years ago, I started introducing some varied tree species into my small larch wood. Almost 90% was destroyed by human vandalism. There's a footpath through the middle of the wood. Does the panel have any suggestions to managing human beings in this situation? I spent a lot of time and money investing in these new saplings. So very sorry to hear that, whoever the questioner is. And again, Phil, you answered that partly in the chat there of some various ideas. So perhaps I'll start with you again, just because you started to answer that question, and then we'll move to the other two.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously I don't know the specifics of this case, but sometimes, by creating a permissive path yourself, you sometimes can direct your walkers around your wood. Perhaps if you put a seat or a pond or an information board in, saying how you're helping the environment, it might make that more attractive route, rather than, obviously you can't block an official route, and it's still quite difficult to reroute public footpaths. But we've got a slightly different environment here, where sometimes the alternative route, perhaps if it took in a better view as well, might be in one way or another. The final thing I'd say is also recruiting some volunteers who might be able to do a bit of explaining, or a bit more explain to those that might cause harm. And the other thing is, then we need to just beef up the countryside code to make sure that people are aware. We want that, as farmers, we're welcoming to people in the countryside, but we need to have responsible access as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When we converted to slightly more diverse farming on the NIAB site, we put a lot of boards up saying what we were doing and why we were doing it, not only for our own visitors, but for anyone that entered the site. Stephen, I think you mentioned that you'd lost a few trees when you started off. Have you got any comments to make?
No, I think Phil's covered it all. I mean, really, humans will be humans, and if they don't like something, they'll do something, negative. Just as we lost a few trees because people decided that they were better off if they stole them. You can only do what you can do, and I think being proactive and trying to explain is probably the best way.
Yeah, Jenny, did you have anything to add?
I suppose the only thing I'd add is that people value them when they're educated properly about the position of humans in the natural world, as well as everything else. So there's probably a bigger discussion about education policy to be had about why those people didn't value those trees.
Absolutely.
That's all.
So I have a small question here, but gosh, it's a big answer. So do trees compete for nutrients with other crops? So this was covered to an extent by your talks, but I think I'm going to start with you, Jenny. What would you like to say about competition for nutrients?
Well, there's in any plant community, whether it's a monocultural or a diverse plant community, there's always competition. That's how plant communities develop. But everything in a community plays its own role. And they share out resources if they're not stressed and all the rest of it. So what Phil said about the right tree, right place is absolutely right. You can't just take something and put it into a landscape where it doesn't belong. You do have to think about the ecology of what's happening around that. So, and Steve was talking about root pruning and all those sorts of things. There's a management issue here, which means that you have to understand the relationships between the things that you're planting together. As you would with animals, I suppose. So again, I think actually, understanding the complexity of farming systems is one of the opportunities for the future, because it makes it much more interesting. And when you talk to people like Steve and Phil, who are thinking about the complexity, you can just see their faces light up, because it's a wonderful thing to understand, isn't it, to where things fit together in nature. And
certainly our experience, Jenny, if I may chip in, is that we were fairly deliberate in what we wanted to do. We wanted to mix perennials and annuals, and we recognised that the annuals and the perennials don't necessarily compete in the same space or at the same time for those same resources. So it was a deliberate choice between the tree component and the crop components to make sure that they didn't compete in the same space and time. And as you rightly said, the management for root pruning or canopy pruning is to try and differentiate and segregate that competition to make them be mutually beneficial rather than antagonistic in terms of competition.
And I suppose the other thing to say as well is that trees, and because of their big roots and their associations with mycorrhizae, actually make mineral, components much more available to the surface. That's what they do in natural systems. So, if you're talking about, will they nickel the nitrogen I've just put on my crop? Well, that's another question from, will I have more, cobalt and whatever it was from willow in my sheep's diet, because you have these plants which are accumulating something which an annual crop couldn't do. So again, very complex, but advantages and disadvantages to be weighed up and understood.
Diversity overcomes a lot of the issues.
Absolutely. So I've got a sort of semi-related question, which is, what about shading of plants that grow next to or alongside of the trees? And I think, Stephen, I'll start you on that one.
Okay, so farmers will often say that nothing grows under the north side of a woodland because it's shaded and the trees are 10, 20 meters tall, and that's very true. So our agroforestry systems, or good agroforestry systems, are designed to try and minimize that competition. So our tree lines run north-south in our northern latitude, so that the sun comes up in the east and down in the west, so it minimizes shading. And also we've picked trees which aren't too tall. If we had taller trees, we'd have wider alleys. So we're trying to minimize that shading competition. And again, not only are we pruning the roots, we're pruning the canopies to try and minimize that competition from shade. So it's never fair to say, people will quite often quote, nothing grows under a north side of a woodland. Yeah, well, that tree probably hasn't been managed. It's just been let grow for 50 years. So, of course, it's got a big root system and a big canopy, which is going to shade out other annual crops which can't compete. So it's about management and about system design.
Absolutely. Phil, did you want to add anything to that?
Not really, only that sometimes if you have got unproductive areas that are on the north side of the tree, there is an opportunity to use other habitats for things like crop pest predators. So you can put in, mixes of umbellifers and wildflowers, which might do some benefit somewhere else. It's once again that business about a multifunctional landscape. As we get more pressure on the way we grow things, then we may well find that might be an attractive option to some farmers. And if it comes into our future agri-environment schemes, then that would help.
Indeed. So I've got a very long question here. I might try and précis a little bit. Does anyone know which British grown nut is most in demand? Thinking of planting nut trees instead of fruit ones as a startup for a non-profit organisation with aspirations to model a project following in your footsteps. So, Phil, what would you think about the best nut species, perhaps to start with?
Well, I can't declare to be an expert on it. What I can do is to talk about what are the things other people are suggesting, and there are a few farmers that have grown nut trees, but once again, it's about the management of them. So I think basically walnuts, cob nuts, and almonds are probably about the three would be the most popular. There may well be some chance of sweet chestnut, but I think you've got to be looking at soil type, where and often sweet chestnut is grown for other reasons rather than the nut. But those would be the ones that we'd be looking for, and we'd be looking for ones that were suitable to our climate. Often the nuts we're buying from all over the world, very commercially grown. But the point I would make about growing nuts and fruit is that this is all about joining collaboration with other people. This is about forming perhaps marketing group, perhaps existing clusters that already exist that may well be for environmental reasons. You may well have a big area of land which has all the provenance of all biodiversity and all the things it was set up for, has a great ability to market produce from it. And there's lots of expertise in that area. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the farmers, it could be their sons and daughters or relations. And there's lots of people who would be interested in that. and this local provenance. And I think that's what I would stress as well. I probably would give way to Stephen on varieties of things.
Yeah, I think Phil, as well as the ones you mentioned, there's an opportunity for hazel, and also doing a bit of work on the suitability of pecan to UK conditions. And from a nut perspective, it's not only just perhaps nut fruit or the nut itself. There's nut flour and nut oil, and that potentially those protein sources are going to become increasingly important as we move forward from nuts as well as other pulses. So I think nuts, especially for people that can wait a little longer, or a slightly longer time view, because nut trees tend to be a bit slower growing, there's a real opportunity to use nuts as part of an agroforestry system.
Yes, with the possible exception of hazelnuts, they seem to go up at a terrific rate. Okay, we have another question here. What do the panelists think about the role for natural regeneration? So we've talked a lot about tree planting from all of our speakers, but we're talking about natural regeneration, establishing tree cover, and how it can be stimulating. And then he goes on to say, or she, Phil, I'm looking to start a wet forest paludiculture project in the fens. So Jenny, I think I'll start with you first on this one.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, regenerated woodlands are some of the most studied. So you think about, from an academic point of view, some of the wilderness projects show that you can re-establish woodland, in various places, and it will form a diverse plant community. But it does take a while, and you have to go through the pain. I suppose if you're not into brambles, you've got to go through the pain of the brambles and the vegetation succession to where you want to be. So it depends where you want to be and how quickly you want to get there.
Yeah, I guess what they're asking is, what can you do to really encourage that natural regeneration from a standing start?
Well, the only thing I can think of really is herbivory. Somebody else asked a question about how do you stop big herbivores eating what, up here in the Highlands, fencing off, land from deer is obviously the best way to encourage the growth of saplings that would otherwise be grazed down by herbivores. So, fencing off, and it depends, if it's a very, very waterlogged area, unless you want very, very species that will live in a very waterlogged area, you probably would have to establish them because, wet areas tend not to have rooting environments which are would encourage the growth of specific trees. The thing to do, I suppose, if you are interested in that, is to look at a natural system which has trees in it, which is wet. So I know that, if you're interested in trees and you're not an expert, reading the Oliver Rackham books is amazing, because then you start to realise what kind of legacy forestry did have in this country, and and I'm sure they were similar for other countries. If you read about what grows naturally along riparian zones next to rivers, things like alder, which is a nitrogen fixer, will do your two services at the same time, and they don't mind growing in wet areas. So I think it just takes a bit of investigation, but really it's so interesting. And also you start to realise, what the kind of knowledge that we've kind of lost about how these systems can exist in our, multi-purpose landscape, as Phil was saying.
So what, Phil, you've got your particular question there relating to paludiculture.
Yeah,
so about that term recently.
Well, yeah, I think really the things that traditionally have been in those areas, they've been poplar and willow that have grown in those areas. On our particular soil, Jenny's mentioned alder. Alder, willow, thorn are the quick regenerators on our sort of land. I think the other thing to remember about regeneration is, especially with things like alder, it can be the other way around as well. You've got to manage them as well, because otherwise what you get is you get lots and lots and lots of very thin, small trees, and you don't get many standers. Now, a bit of variety is not a problem, but sometimes that can be quite a good resource as well for heating systems. You can open up bits, leave certain bits, and once again, you're creating a variety of habitat. I would once again look at resources on an agroforestry handbook. There's another piece of work that'll be out in the next couple of months where we're doing, and it will probably be on agroecology, which will look at exactly this sort of thing. What are the best trees for the right place? You know, and how does it fit in with the product? Ah, that's the one. There he is. Look at that. And my trusty assistant has it on the screen. Well done, Stephen. Thank you very much.
It's never more than a hand reach away.
Yeah, excellent.
So thank you, panel. You've been brilliant. There's one or two questions we haven't managed to address yet. We've got about 1 minute, according to my watch, left on this session. So just to remind everybody that if you want to talk to the panel further, we have a Zoom link, which I guess has been circulated to you. So we will repair to that other place, that other room, so to speak, virtual room, and you can maybe ask some more specific questions face to face with our panel. So I guess it only remains for me to say thank you so much to the panel. It's been a brilliant session. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I look forward to more in the conference going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.